Okay, welcome. Today we're going to talk about a pretty exciting topic and certainly one that really comes up all the time as a question, and that is, how do I actually formulate with botanicals? Okay, I've understood what I want it to do and I know the outcomes, where we're going, but how do I actually put these together in a way that optimizes their actions and gets their doses closest to where we want them to be? It's absolutely important to the overall efficacy of our formula. And there are some tips and tricks that help us, well, maybe not even tricks, but just ways to put that together so that we get closer and closer to the formula that we want. Then what we're going to do is, once we've talked about a little bit about how to do it, we're going to walk through an example and actually go step by step as to when to do what and how to optimize those overlaps. The first and the most important part of effective botanical prescribing is effective clinical assessment. If your assessment, we can't always get it right, certainly, but the closer to the truth your assessment is, closer to accurate your assessment is, the more effectively you can tailor a formula to meet that. And that's really important. We spend a lot of time trying to make sure that your assessment is as accurate and effective as possible. That allows us to come up with the ideal actions, which then allows us to come up with the ideal herbs. And that gets us into step 2, which is, once you've got an effective working assessment, choose the actions that go with it. It's very tempting to go from, okay, we've got this assessment, it's an acute cold and flu, and just start to think about herbs that go with that. But even in acute prescribing, like an antimicrobial formula, we will have different actions. Do you want to add decongestant? Do you want to add immune stimulant? Some of that, a lot of that, will vary patient to patient, case by case. So pausing in that in-between step to actually decide which actions you want to use really helps better herb selection, because you can choose ones with overlapping actions. And that's basically our step 3, is once you've decided on your actions, one of the ways to do this, especially if you're fairly new to it, is to take all the actions you want and then just simply list all the herbs you know that match with each action. Now, in some cases, that's a long list. You don't have to go through all of them. But what you want to do is allow that to guide your thinking so that you recognize, oh, glycyrrhiza, antiviral, demulcent, adaptogen. Okay, you've got some herbs on your list that do multiple actions that you want in your formula. And this is really how we go from good formulas to great formulas, is when all of the herbs in your formula have a secondary action that matches one of your first. Now, maybe your primary decongestant is a secondary antimicrobial and the other way around, but making sure, or trying to do what you can to optimize and overlap all of those actions. What you want to avoid, and it's really easy and tempting, is one-to-one action herb. Okay, I want an antimicrobial, so I'm going to choose Hydrastis. Okay, I want an adaptogen, so I'm going to choose my favorite, which is Withania. Hydrastis and Withania have very few overlapping actions. So what we want to try to do is, if you know you want adaptogen, try to choose an antimicrobial that has some adaptogenic properties. Next, what you want to do is decide how you want to give your formula. And I think this is undervalued currently, at least in a lot of our understanding or application of botanical medicine, is tinctures are not even close to the only way to give herbs, and often they're not even the best way to give herbs. Infusions, decoctions, powders, not to mention topical applications, sometimes are the preferred route of delivery depending on what you want to work with. So we often we quickly think of tinctures because they're easier to mix and they're higher patient compliance. But sometimes the alternative, which shouldn't be classed as alternative, just the other ways of preparing a formula, are a better effect. In terms of adaptogens specifically, I almost never give them as tinctures. Wherever possible, which is quite a percentage of the time, I'll give them as powders. That's still very high compliance because you simply add your powder to some water and you take it, or even better, as decoctions. Have someone actually boil for 45 minutes much like TCM does. Boil their herbs for 45 minutes. Then they're drinking a liter of it. And this is going to be really important when we look at doses in a minute. Often tinctures, their biggest drawback is to get to therapeutic doses, we get very quickly into doses of 2 tablespoons a day, which has the drawback of being somewhat expensive depending on your cost of tinctures. So being able to actually achieve therapeutic dose sometimes means choosing a non-tincture route, often preferably choosing a non-tincture route so you can keep the cost down but your dose at your therapeutic dose. Now, a question that comes up here that is really important to address is, and this is sometimes said, don't dose the herb, dose the action. So if you've got multiple herbs that are antimicrobial, you don't need to hit therapeutic dose with any of them because synergistically is the word that gets used there. They add up to a strong antimicrobial action. There's certainly some truth to synergy, no question about that. However, the closer you get all of your herbs to therapeutic dose, the more likely you are to achieve the therapeutic outcomes as desired. And this isn't on our list, but it should be. Step 2 after your assessment is, what are your clinical outcomes? What do you actually want to see as a result of your formula? And then you continue to build from there. So our step 5 here is look up the reference doses. Now, of course, that can be tedious because that can take a while depending on how many herbs you have in your formula. But until you intuitively know, or just have memorized some of the therapeutic doses, look them up. You'll find it quite advantageous. There are a handful of herbs, like astragalus and burdock, for example, that really are, their therapeutic doses are notably higher than a lot of the standard therapeutic doses. And in knowing that, you can say, okay, even though astragalus isn't my primary herb, it shows up in the formula at a greater volume, a greater percentage, because the therapeutic dose is higher. So, useful in the beginning to look up those references. Then you decide, this is where you have full creative license, you decide where you want that herb to fall in the reference range. The reference range is often between 1 and 5 or 2 and 10, so you can choose. If this herb's your primary, maybe you bring it up to the top end of the reference dose. If an herb is really only there because it's got 3 overlapping secondary actions, maybe you keep it closer to the lower end of the reference dose. And this is where some of the real art of botanical prescribing comes in. Ideally, though, most, if not all, of the herbs in the formula will achieve the minimum therapeutic dose. Now, we could say, well, therapeutic doses, who even really has verified those? And there's some truth to that, for sure. And this is actually another really important fact. When the most important determinant of the quality of your tincture or your loose herb is the quality of the source material. You could have a 1 to 2, but if it came from not so great source material, it's really not that strong. And you can have a 1 to 5, but if it was really done well, it can be notably more effective than the proportion at which it was prepared. And so that really does make a big difference when we talk about what we're actually using as our final medicines. However, we're going to assume for the purposes of this that all of your stuff is top quality stuff. And really what we're talking about here is getting into that therapeutic dose range. From here, I like to do it this way. There are lots of different ways to formulate. Some practitioners favor the parts route, where they say, okay, astragalus is my primary, so I want 3 parts. And rhodiola is my secondary, so I'm going to go with 2 parts of that one, and then everything else is 1 part. Where that gets complicated is those parts, if they don't add up to 10 or 100, you start getting awkward numbers. You start having to divide 100 mils into 13 parts and you end up with decimals and fractions. That's fine, but it does mean a lot more tedious work when you're measuring out your volume or weighing it out. I favor, be it formulating for powders, decoctions, infusions, etc., always proportionally added up to 100. That way, it's very easy to scale. If you say, okay, I made it to 100, but I actually want to use a full pound of it, you just multiply by 4.54. And that's a little bit complicated math. Where it's easier is if you made it up to 100 and you want a 500 ml bottle, you just multiply by 5. So that way you've got a base formulation based on doses and based on percentages that you can easily scale from there. Of course, the last step in determining what we want to do is how long do you want your patient to take your formula. That's going to play a role in in your dosing, sure, but it's also going to play a role in determining what's the optimal method of delivery. Most people will boil herbs for 10 days. Will they do it for 6 months? Maybe, some people do, but it certainly is a much higher investment to boil herbs every day or two for 6 months. So now let's take a look at an example. Let's actually walk through the steps, see if we can build a formula. Step 1, confirm your assessment. So here we've chosen adult onset acne secondary to improper hormone clearance and elimination by the liver. One of the things, and we of course had the time to craft this assessment, but one of the most important things is the assessment should be as specific as you can make it. Not just acne. That really doesn't tell us too much. An assessment like this suggests what's the etiology of acne. We know there are multiple. There are at least 3 different really definitive causes or correlates perhaps of acne, and each one will bring about a different set of botanical or other actions and really change the treatment quite considerably. So what we're saying with an assessment like this is, yep, acne is what we see. This is the patient's chief concern is acne, but we're suggesting it's because of the liver. It's because the liver is not effectively breaking down, clearing, eliminating these hormones. So that gets us into our step 2. Let's look at what actions then match this. Obviously, the first one's going to be, well, actually even beyond that, the broadest will be alterative. Really, everything we put in here would class or subclass as an alterative. Now, alteratives can be broken down into many different subclasses. You could say hepatics are simply alteratives for the liver. You could say cholagogues are they're like alternatives for the gallbladder. What we're going to look at here are some liver-specific alternatives, and we'll specifically name the hepatics as well, although of course those are going to overlap. Here's where, in a lot of ways, once you've chosen your actions, you can kind of do whatever you want with the herbs in there. The herbs have their actions, and their actions are based on constituents and research and traditional use, but you have lots of creative license to add, remove, change, have an opinion on the actual herbs that you choose. So what we've chosen for our actions first are alterative, and then we want some skin-specific alternatives. We know some alternatives have a higher affinity, usually through the liver, but not always, for treating skin conditions. We've mentioned specifically hepatics here. Now we'll see that most of them overlap, but that's another way that you can focus on that. These are our primary actions. For secondary actions, we've got laxative. In this case, we've called it a mild laxative, and we've got even antimicrobial. Laxative, you could choose this because we know things that help eliminate hormones in particular that hang out for a long time in the intestines, have some reabsorption into the body and have some activity. Often when we talk about hormones, it isn't necessarily that the hormones themselves are being overproduced, but rather the pharmacokinetics of those hormones within the body are not being optimized and are leading to some side effects. They're not being metabolically deactivated in a way that allows them to achieve what they're supposed to achieve without some side effect. Antimicrobial, now the nice thing here, we can include antimicrobial, but you can see these herbs under our antimicrobial list are already included in our primary actions. So it's almost like we can achieve that antimicrobial action quite secondarily, quite incidentally by the selection of our primary herbs. We've decided here to go with the tincture. Now, all of the herbs that we just saw, you could certainly use a decoction. Would it be better in this case? Maybe. Maybe it would. If we know we're working with the processes of the liver, is alcohol the optimal way to deliver? Some say so low dose of alcohol doesn't make a difference. Others say, you know what, might as well avoid it if you can. Totally your choice to make that decision. We've chosen tincture here, but you could easily choose decoction. You probably couldn't choose infusion in this case because a lot of the rooty herbs that we just saw don't infuse very well. But it would be equally, maybe even more effective to use a decoction. Now we get into some numbers and we start to talk about how to proportion some of this. So what we've done here is we've looked up the reference doses. Here they are. You can find these. They're pretty easy to come by. And you can see they've all got a range. In the second column, what we're looking at is proportionally how to do that. We won't go through all of the math because that's fairly boring, but it's pretty straightforward to go from this is the desired per day amount, and then I choose this reference, this number within the range, and then you let that further guide, let that inform how you're going to put it together in the percentage of your final formula as you build it to 100. What that will do will allow you to also come up with a dose. In this case, we see our dose comes out to about 35, in this case mils, per day. That means 2 tablespoons. That's a high dose. If that dose makes you uncomfortable, pause, reflect on that. You could say, you have a couple options. One, you could say that dose is just too high. But if you're going to say that, you want to have some basis for saying that, because if you drop everything below the therapeutic range, is it still therapeutic? Maybe. Up to you to make that decision. Or you say, okay, this dose is high. Am I comfortable with this dose? Is this realistic and sustainable for this formula with this patient as I wish to prescribe it today? If your answer is no, that's too much tincture, I don't want to do that, look at other routes. Powders are very underrated. Powders are dosed exactly the same as tinctures, except that you just take them as a powder. A good powder is just as effective as a tincture, and probably in my opinion, undervalued as a means of delivery. They're so easy. You can mix them on the spot, shake them together, and simply give someone their formula ready to go, mix it into water. So you could do this formula as tincture, as powder, or as decoction. Here, as per our calculations, we've decided to go with 1 tablespoon twice a day for 2 weeks. And 2 weeks is a nice amount of time because, especially when we talk about acne, we've got a pretty measurable outcome, which is resolution or improvement of acne lesions, either lowered frequency or lowered intensity. Choosing something, or choosing both of those as our outcome measures that we're tracking, 2 weeks is a reasonable amount of time to expect to see change. You could say 3, you could say 10 days, that would be fine. But you want to be able to define an endpoint by which you will see the outcomes you're looking for. If after 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, you have not achieved the desired outcomes, you go back to step 1. You reevaluate your assessment. Okay, so acne is still present. Is there something that I'm missing? Is this assessment incorrect? Is in fact nothing to do with the liver and everything to do with food sensitivities or another cause? You return to your assessment and reevaluate. Or you say, no, I still think the assessment's correct, but I'm not sure I chose the actions that match it as well, or the herbs that match those actions as well. But reassessing for efficacy should always be part of the plan. In my opinion, a patient coming back with the phrase, yes, I think it helped a little, is never acceptable. It's not achieving desired outcomes. And wonderful if they do feel it helped a little bit, and certainly wonderful it actually did help a little bit, but it usually means we can be better, we can do better. Let's see what else we can figure out. All right, so we've looked at an example of how to put together a formula, in this case for adult onset acne. And we've kind of walked through the steps to do it. It seems fairly long in the beginning, and it often is. It's like learning long division. It's useful to practice it a few times. Eventually, sooner than later, you can do most of this in your head, and that's a wonderful way to do it. But probably the most valuable parts of that are start with a good assessment, formulate your actions, then build your formula from there. Hope that's been helpful. Good luck and happy formulating.